I believe that the days of the 22nd and the 23rd of May 2015 will go down in history as some of the greatest demonstrations for freedom in the history of our nation. And when the Seanad passes this bill, and when President Michael D. Higgins signs it, and when our two women ministers, Minister Fitzgerald and our Taoiseach Joan Burton, agree when it shall be commenced, then we will be able to say, free at last, free at last. Thank God, we are free at last.
Senator Bacik.
Well, follow that, I think, Senator Éireann. I was hoping I wouldn't be speaking after you. Seriously, it gives me enormous pleasure, Minister, to welcome you to the House as a Minister who has led so strongly on this issue and on the process that has led us to this stage. And it gives me enormous pleasure to lead for Labour at the second stage of the Marriage Bill 2015. The bill made possible, as we know, due to the resounding yes vote in the May referendum on marriage equality. And like the other speakers, I would also like to welcome very warmly to the public gallery so many of you who made that resounding yes vote possible. The leaders of the Yes Equality campaign, the Marriage Equality Group, the Glen organisation, the ICCL, so many other groups who've campaigned for so long on LGBT rights, on women's rights, on groups like USI that campaigned with the student body and made sure so many young people were registered. Campaigns like from the trade union movement. We had an enormous coalition of civil society groupings that came together on this. Children's rights organisations, groups that perhaps wouldn't have been expected to come to the fore, came to the fore, and that was one of the enormous strengths of the campaign. There are too many people to name individually, and I'm mindful of the Lasca Hirlig's ruling on this, but if I could just say to Gráinne Healy and Brian Sheehan, you were such powerful spokespersons for Yes Equality, and I think you played an enormous role in this. Could I also, just as others have done, welcome Anne-Louise Gilligan, particularly to the gallery. And it was such a proud moment for me when I was in the High Court on your behalf, along with my good friend and colleague Senator Éireann all those years ago, battling for the recognition of the right to marry. And at the time, perhaps we thought it might come sooner, and it has been a long process. But I must say that it was a wonderful moment to see it happen on 22nd of May this year. And also, of course, to pay tribute to Senator Norris and to recall Senator Norris even longer ago than that, I think, when you introduced the Civil Partnership Bill in the Seanad, a bill on which I'd worked with you. And at that point, I think we did say it would be open to both gay and straight couples. We weren't bound by the same constraints the Minister is clearly bound by in terms of Attorney General's advice. So it has been a long process. And in particular, I suppose, I also do want to welcome to the public gallery members of the Labour Party, Labour LGBT, Labour Youth, Labour Women, who campaigned so strongly on this. And to say, I think it's fair to say, that the Labour Party had an enormous role to play in the putting of this referendum to the people. We have a proud history in our party of campaigning for equality and for rights in terms of social justice, a social agenda, contraception rights, divorce in the 90s, the X-case legislation more recently, gender recognition legislation. Labour has led on all of these issues, and it led on the marriage equality issue too. And Senator Bryan very generously, I think, paid tribute to Eamon Gilmore, who was Taoiseach, pushed this issue when it was not popular across the political spectrum. And I think, I don't know if anyone has mentioned the Constitutional Convention, because that too, and those incredibly giving people, the citizen members of the Convention, who gave of their time so generously over, I think, a 14-month period in the end, and who voted so overwhelmingly in support of putting a referendum to the people on marriage equality. Again, I think that was part of the process that made marriage equality possible. And when we're talking about the process, also to acknowledge a previous government that put into place the civil partnership legislation that, again, I think helped to change people's minds and to make people see that marriage equality was a real possibility, that this was something that could be brought into place and that the sky would not fall in if it did. So I think we have a whole range of different processes and developments that culminated in the overwhelmingly successful campaign that resulted in the yes vote on the 22nd of May. And as we said at the time when campaigning for the yes vote, the marriage equality referendum was a very straightforward referendum. We were being asked to vote on an issue of equality, and we were being asked to vote simply to put 17 words into the Constitution, which of course we did. Marriage may be contracted in accordance with law by two persons without distinction as to their sex. And it's those 17 words which have enabled what we hope will be the speedy passage of this bill, first through the Dáil and now through this House. During the campaign, I set out what I saw as 3 key reasons to vote yes, and I thought it was worth revisiting those today as we look at this bill. The first key reason was that gay couples would be able to get married, and that, of course, was the simple and straightforward message of the referendum. And the legislation, once passed, this legislation, the purpose of it is to put in place the legislative provisions to enable couples to marry without distinctions to their sex. So while the provisions are complex, Minister, and you've taken us through them comprehensively, there is a very simple purpose to them, and it was that simple purpose, I think, that brought people around to vote yes in May. The second point that I argued in May was that the rights of children would be strengthened and affirmed. And I think if there's one provision in this bill that really, one of many that stands out, I suppose, is section 16, which enables, as the Minister has said, which enables the equal guardianship rights for gay couples. And that's hugely important for children also. And that was an argument that was made very strongly. And that was why all the main children's rights organisations endorsed a yes vote. And finally, we would have a more equal Ireland, was the argument we made in campaigning and knocking on doors for the yes campaign. And I think there can be no doubt about that with the passage of the referendum and with the coming passage of this bill and its speedy enactment and commencement, we will see Ireland joining, as others have said, a growing European and international consensus that there is no valid legal basis to discriminate against same-sex couples. We felt this was an immensely positive message to send out to the world, particularly so, as the Minister has said, that we are unique in the world for being the first and to date only country, sovereign country, to have affirmed the right to marry for gay couples through popular vote. So, of course, the message of Ireland as equal was hugely important. I said there were a number of hugely important provisions. They're all important, of course, all 24 in the bill. But if I could single out perhaps 3 provisions in the bill before finishing. I've already mentioned section 16 and children's rights. Section 4 is, of course, the key provision, and the Minister has pointed out it is really the single most important in terms of giving effect to the referendum. And that is the provision that amends the dreaded section 2.2 of the Civil Registration Act 2004, which formed such an important role in earlier litigation, and which put in place a statutory block or obstacle to gay couples to marry. And I think while in 2013 we had put forward a private member's bill for Labour senators to delete the relevant provision, it's really good to see it finally being deleted in this government legislation. Secondly, section 7 of the bill, the Minister mentioned it and indeed went into some detail on it. This provision, of course, is hugely important because it makes clear that religious solemnisers are not obliged to solemnise marriages between same-sex couples. But clearly it's also important, and it was an important part of the campaign when those against the referendum argued that religious bodies might be somehow be coerced in some way. But I think it's also important to note that Section 7 does enable those religious bodies, and there are many, and indeed secular solemnisers for the Humanist Association, it does enable them to conduct same-sex marriages. That's hugely important. And in that context, I just wanted to mention to you, Minister, one point that Senator Éireann Hayden in particular asked me to raise, and that is about the lack of provision for sufficient numbers of civil registrars and secular solemnisers. Looking at the figures, there are 5,000 religious solemnisers, only 105 registrars, and only 14 currently accredited humanist solemnisers. We only have the secular humanist solemnisers because of legislation that I originally introduced as a Labour bill here in the Seanad, and that Minister Joan Burton took up, the Civil Registration Amendment Act, which does enable secular solemnisers. But I do think we need to look at this in future legislation, as there will clearly be increased demand for civil and secular solemnisers to be able to contract legal weddings. Could I finally mention section 24? And that is, of course, the provision which removes and deals with the so-called forced divorce clause in the Gender Recognition Act. And that's very welcome, as you said, Minister, to see that being brought in so speedily. So could I just conclude by welcoming again, this bill in the strongest terms, and also welcoming your announcement, and I think you just said it on the record in the Seanad, that you would be commencing the bill within 2 weeks of enactment, that you and Minister Burton would be working to ensure it would be commenced within 2 weeks of enactment. Now, that's hugely welcome because, of course, it will enable speedy processing then of applications to marry. Senator Zappone referred to the pure joy that was felt. We all felt it, those of us who were privileged to be in Dublin Castle on 23rd of May, but all of us who were celebrating the result around Ireland and indeed around the world after the overwhelming vote.
Please, a minute and a half.
I'm sorry,
over.
I'll finish.
And I was
just wanted
very
to say,
reluctant to disturb you
thank you
in
for
train
your
of thought, but you're a minute and a half.
But I just say, I hope we'll find so many more moments of pure joy being felt in families and communities all around Ireland as we proceed to commence this important bill.
Well, got Senator Norris.
Thank you very much, Lasky. I'd like to welcome the Minister to a House with which she is very familiar as former Leader of the Opposition, and to thank her very much for her gracious acknowledgement of the role I played.